All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Crispino. I'm the Director of Developer Evangelism here at Genesys. And this is our Devcast. It was supposed to be for July. We moved it just one day and we got into August, at least into August for the US. We're an extra day into August where our host is. Our topic for today is empowering your customer engagement with Genesys Cloud's native mobile app integration options. And our speaker today is Matt McPhee. He's a principal solution consultant from the Asia Pac region, from the solution consultants there. So it's an early morning for him. It's 7 a.m. in Australia. And he's going to kind of go through how to develop mobile applications for Genesys Cloud. But before we get there, just a few extra slides here. That doesn't seem right. I think I went too far. No, I guess I went all right. All right, yeah. So we'll have a 10-minute Q&A at the end of this tutorial, or we'll try to keep a 10-minute Q&A. But we are recording this. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and you can get to that from developer.genesys.cloud/video. That is the video section of our developer center. And just a shameful plug for next month, or maybe actually the end of August, where our next Devcast will be the last Tuesday in August on the 29th. I will be your host. I will be presenting third-party media and business process task routing using the new task management APIs and routing built into Genesys Cloud. So you'll be able to register for that in a couple more weeks on the Developer Center under the Devcast and newsletter section. And if you have any thoughts, we've got a URL there, or you can email Janessa Barrera, and she will collect topics that you would like to see, and we'll schedule those for an upcoming event. And with that, I am going to get out of your way, and I'm going to hand this over to Matt, and he can start sharing and take you through what he has to present. All right, Matt.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. Let me just start the screen share. All right, there we go. Okay, so welcome everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about basically integrating Genesys Cloud with native mobile apps. Okay, so to Jim's point, I've got my slides listed as the 2nd of August. I know where a lot of you guys are, it's the 1st today, but yeah, that's what happens when you're around the world. All right. So I didn't record this ahead of time, basically, is what I'm getting at. This is live. So first of all, from a mobile app perspective, there's a couple of different ways you can integrate and tool sets you can use for integrating and building mobile apps in with Genesys Cloud. So a lot of times I'll have customers come to me and go, hey, we want to integrate our existing app into Genesys Cloud. And I'll be like, okay, well, how's his existing app built? Is it, a actual native, Apple Swift code base, and then you've got a completely separate native Java code base for Android? Or are you using more of an all-in-one code base, with tool sets such as Flutter, React, or even a progressive web app? I've seen a lot of customers, say that they have a native web app, but it's actually, or a native app, sorry, but it's actually more of a web app, looking and feeling like a native app as well. The reason these things are important is depending on the code base that you're using and the ecosystem your existing app is built in, kind of leads you down different paths of what your options are and how you want to do it. The other things to consider then is what backends are you actually integrating your app with? Here in this part of the world, Firebase is probably the most common one that I've come across with our customers on, people that have backend as a service for their apps. But there are other companies and software vendors out there that do similar things, as well as some organizations just have a direct connection between the client and the apps themselves as well. But these different considerations do cause things on the left here. So you've got things to consider around, battery usage. The big one that's always the largest talking point with every customer is push notifications. And I've got a whole section and slides and even some examples talking about push notifications, but that is by far always the biggest one. Then there's other things that people don't necessarily think of up front, but do come into it later on, especially when you have more and more versions. And that is the different device types you want to support, the operating system versions, and then data and analytics that you're getting back and how you're going to handle updates of the app and all that sort of stuff as well. Battery usage is another one to really make sure you optimize. There's nothing worse than installing an app that just drains your battery. I've had that a couple of times with third-party apps, and all I do then is uninstall it. So just some things to consider with the first part of it. From there, you've then got your options within Genesys Cloud. Okay, so there's not one option to suit all straight out the gate. Okay, it's not like I can say, do this option all of the time, because depending on your ecosystem that I spoke about before, there may be a different option, as well as the features that you require from the app itself could actually differ depending on which way you're going as well. So first of all, if I just go from left to right, we've got the so the HTML widget. That's the web messaging widget that is designed to be deployed on a native website, and we'll probably all use that today with web messaging. And if you haven't, it's a pre-built basic iframe that sits on the web page and does all the communications and the WebSockets and everything. That is designed though to work on a full browser. If you're doing, and I've seen a lot of customers do this, where they create a what's called a web view and put it inside their mobile app. A web view is different to a web browser. It's basically a stripped down version of a web browser. And I would not be recommending putting that inside a web view because the way it handles cookies and session tokens and everything like that is a little bit different. The next option you have is the Web Messenger API, which is essentially the same backend as the Web Messenger, but the raw RESTful API. You can do this, you can use this. It's a direct WebSocket communication to our server side within Genesys Cloud. You do have to build it all up on the RESTful API, but that is an option. The evolution of that, though, is actually what we created, the transport SDKs. So they're available in Swift and Java for Apple and Android ecosystems. And they're basically an SDK wrapper over the top of the Web Messenger API. So it's a direct communication, once again, between the mobile app and Genesys Cloud. And that's quite a good option. And there's more features coming into that as we go. It's a relatively newer option as far as the other ones listed here on the page. And I'll talk about some of the newer things coming into that soon. Then the last option is the Open Messaging API. Now, while the Open Messaging API is a raw RESTful API, because it's part of our platform, it is actually also offered in the platform SDKs that we deliver, such as JavaScript, Node.js, those other different ones that we have. Right. So once again, I would not be suggesting putting the Web Messenger widget in a web view. It's designed for web browser. I have seen people do that. To my point earlier, it was very quick for them to get up and running, but then later on downstream, they ran into limitations, they'd run into problems and then say, hey, Matt, why can't we do X, Y, Z? And I hate to say I told you so. So word of warning, POCs are very good to get up and running quick, but just you got to have the long-term goal in mind. All right, so if we look at the Web Messenger API, and this architecture is basically the same for the Transport SDK as well. It's just got the native SDK wrappers over the top of it. It's a direct secure WebSocket connection between your client side and our server side, okay? So some of the things and considerations of this. So if I've got some of the negative ones up the top here, but from a positive perspective, yes, it is quicker and easier to get up and running. You can build an app, and just have nothing in between and have a direct communication between. Some of the things you got to be cautious of in this particular design is the history is actually controlled based on our API. So what I mean by that is when you do a GET request to get the previous history, it's controlled via the Web Messaging API. And as it stands today, that is set on a 15-day time period. It is roadmapped to be configurable, but right now today it's 15 days and you can't actually change it. The other thing with that is it's heavy from a client side perspective. So what I mean by that is all your code that you're building, all the config, everything is within the client side. So sometimes that will raise an eyebrow to security teams, as well as from a battery life perspective, you've got to think it's constantly running to have communication, and it needs that WebSocket completely up. So when we're talking about things like push notifications, which is always the hottest topic, what this means is if this app is actually fully closed, or the operating system of the device itself actually closes down this WebSocket to reserve battery life, it means you're not going to receive the messages from the Genesys Cloud server side. Okay, there are some roadmap items to do with the transport SDK to get around that, which I'll talk about later on. But right now, the way it stands is if you actually swiped up and closed this app, or it was in the background long enough for the operating system to pause the WebSocket, you would lose that communication. So if the agent sent another message, or you got a notification coming through from GC, you wouldn't receive it. That's as it is today. And at the time of this recording, if you're watching this obviously in the future, the updates that I'm going to talk about later may already be in the platform, but right now that's where it stands and where it sits. So there's some cautionary tales today right now around leveraging the direct WebSocket connection option, in my opinion. The other option, and the reason I didn't do this for the Transport SDK, is the Transport SDK is the same under the hood as the web messaging one, just with those wrappers over the top. The other option is the Open Messaging API. Now, this is my personal preference. It's not everyone's preference, but the reason it's mine is because you actually get to have a bit of middleware between your client-side app and Genesys Cloud. So straight out the gate, most people go, okay, well, that's going to be a lot more work for me. Why do I want to do this extra effort? It's going to be more support for me, and just kind of, turn away from that. Straight away, it moves the architecture away from WebSockets and actually uses a webhook from Genesys Cloud. Okay, so if anyone on the call has done anything around trying to build a scalable WebSocket solution, especially in serverless tech, there's a lot to it. So if you were looking at building out your own middleware between web messaging and Genesys Cloud, that's not as easy as it sounds. Whereas with webhooks, it's a lot simpler and easier to have this server side in between. So straight away then on your client side, you can then use different communication technologies rather than WebSockets, which makes it a lot lighter from a messaging perspective. The other thing is then, because you have this middleware, you can actually control and cache the amount of history that is shown inside the mobile app. So then it's up to me on how much I'm threading, how much I'm caching, what I'm showing through, as well as having a scroll, down, and then so click here for show more, or dynamic scrolling. So when I get to the top, it can then load in more chunks. Things like that you can get a little bit smarter around, which then helps with battery life and usage, as well as from a push notification perspective. Because you have this middleware, you can do a fair bit more around receiving push notifications from Genesys Cloud and then sending them across to the client side as well. One of the other considerations I don't really have listed on here, but does come up more over time, because it takes away a lot of that complexity, or all the complexity and build being natively inside the app. You then have a split between the client side essentially being what it should be, or in my opinion, what it should be, as in a dumb client that just sees information. The server side then does all the security connections, the messaging. So then when you do updates, depending on what you're updating, often you'll just be updating your back end and you don't actually need to push out a whole new mobile app version. This then has a pretty profound impact when you're adding new features, updating new things, maybe doing security patches. Libraries often, expire and they need patches done to them, dependencies change, all that sort of fun stuff in the dev world. It means then most of the time you're doing, or most of the time, hopefully you're doing it on your server side, not pushing out new app updates. If it's all in the client side, it means then every month or couple of months or whatever it will be, you're going to have to push a new actual app version. If there's a dependency change, you're then going to be reliant on all your users actually installing that updated version, as well as that interim period between when they install it and the old one that's running. You still need to support both versions of that running. So thinking about that alone, while upfront, yes, it's a little bit more of an investment. In my experience, it actually makes it a lot less effort long-term because of that exact reason, that architecture. Okay. So the other thing to consider is Genesys Cloud is typically only also one part of the overall app ecosystem. Often you're pulling in data from other sources as well, third-party APIs. It could be, information could be coming from a CRM to give them updates on, cases and information and all that sort of stuff as well. So by using a middleware service of some description, you can then centralize all these connection points and then have one communication across. In my example that I've built out, and I'm going to go through in detail, is built out on open messaging. I am using Firebase as the back end, and I'm using Flutter as the front end UI, which uses Dart as a programming language. And then I'm able to use the real-time SDK to communicate between both the app as well as my server side. All right, so some of the different features and things that I've implemented within the app. Then you've got authentication. So most apps do have authentication. You don't have to by all means, but it is a good idea, in my opinion, to have authentication. That way you know who the different people are, as well as you can do things like having the app installed on multiple devices, but not having multiple conversations being set up, okay? That's something I should have also mentioned with the difference between web messaging and authenticated web messaging. If you leverage the authentication portion of web messaging in those transports, you can actually have the same session essentially on multiple devices. So if I have it on maybe my mobile phone and I have my tablet, if I start a conversation on here, but I have the app loaded on both, with authenticated messaging, you can actually have that one conversation. So I send a message from the app, it goes into the IVR, an agent answers it, whatever it will be you've got set up. When they respond, the message will pop up on both devices at the same time, and it doesn't matter which one I respond to, it's the same conversation. The same can be done with open messaging, as long as you have the ID of that person being the same, which in my case, I'm using the authentication mechanism for that. So then I could have the app installed on multiple devices. That's something that people often forget to think about at first, and it is quite common for people to have it installed. So you wouldn't want, in that scenario where you have your mobile phone and your iPad to have two separate conversations. You typically want it on both. Like if you log into Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or any of those other tool sets, you expect your same messages, your same conversation thread to be across all your devices, right? So I'm using just a basic login screen here. I'm using Google as the authentication mechanism. You could use whatever you want. Then I've got a basic screen. I've then got my threading in here of messages. You can completely control the color scheme, the fonts, the look and feel of that. It's your app, right? You can build it out to be whatever you want. You can then also integrate into other components of the device itself. So I've got direct integration into things like the camera and the gallery. There was a use case I built up, it was a couple of years ago now, where they also wanted a little touchpad. So you'd bring up a little signature screen. So you could actually use your finger as a touch pen, basically, do a signature, send it in line, and that would go through essentially as a PNG style image where they could get a copy of a signature, stuff like that. But native apps give you the ability to integrate into device pieces as well. Then push notifications. So push notifications, you can see here, I've got one coming up on the top, and that really does, once again, I can't stress enough, depend on how you've built out your environment. File support, emojis, things like that as well, you can come into it. The deeper, more rich media objects like carousels, quick replies, those sorts of things are changing between the different environments, between open messaging, web messaging, and mobile transport SDK. Basically, each of them are coming towards parity, but there is a different feature roadmap between the two. So an example of that is you get typing indicators today using the mobile transport SDK and web messaging API. I think they're just about to go beta on open messaging. I can't remember the exact date, but they're going to be released soon on open messaging. Same with quick replies. Quick replies are available in web messaging. They're going to be released in open messaging soon, and carousels are a little bit further for open messaging. But basically there's that different timeline, but the images, the emojis, all those other things, attachments are supported today across all of them. There is a link on the Resource Center that does have that matrix of what is available on what channel, because it does also then differ for things like Instagram, WhatsApp, stuff like that. But the end goal is for all those features to be available on all those different channel types. Okay. For push notifications as well, as in restarting a conversation, quite often people say, all right, you've got the use case, your customers messaged you in, you've had your conversation, the agent then needs to restart the conversation. This is also a difference between web messaging and open messaging. With open messaging, you can build in a little custom UI, like I've built my extremely ugly one in my interface here. But because I'm using open messaging, I can essentially use the agentless messaging endpoint, which is designed for SMS, WhatsApp, and open messaging. There's also the ability to do it on email, but that then gives me the ability to restart it from the agent's perspective. You can't do that today with web messaging, and the native UI inside Genesys Cloud, where you click, integrate interactions, this little plus symbol. Very soon, that will also give you the ability to do it out of the box with open messaging, because under the hood, we can do that with the agentless messaging capability. So I can't remember the date on that once again, but that will be coming soon. So another difference between web messaging and open messaging. All right. So in my example, what I have a little bit more under the hood, and to leverage the SDKs that we have available, basically I have Firebase using my Cloudflare store, which caches all my real-time messages, and it has a really nice real-time SDK. So it actually sets up and handles that communication. It's not actually just a WebSocket. They've actually got their own layers over the top of that. And they also offer what's called Firebase Cloud Messaging Service, which gives you that push notification, which I'll talk a bit more in a moment. So what that means is then inside my Flutter app, I'm not writing any RESTful API endpoints. I'm actually using the Firebase SDK. And in the Firebase side for my Firestore, I can actually leverage Node.js for my cloud functions, okay? So if you don't like Node.js, you could write them in a different language that's supported by cloud functions. You might want Golang or something along those lines. I just did it in this language because it was probably the most universally easily understood by customers that I have these conversations with. The webhook comes in, I've got a cloud function that listens, updates the Firestore, which then sends the real-time SDK across. This communication then automatically handles it regardless of how many devices that I have across here. So with that app, iPad, those different scenarios, it takes all the stress and headache away from me for scale, as well as caching. Things like if this connection gets lost, the local device will hold it. And then once connection is reestablished, it will only get the new messages that it missed. It doesn't re-download all of them again, things like that. So it's really optimized for mobile and makes your life a lot easier when building out these different things. So one layer further down again, basically there's that Firestore, and I'll show you my source code in a moment. And I have also open sourced this on GitHub. So if anyone wants to have a deeper dig through it in your own time, please feel free to do so. But basically I've got a location here where I've got my user's ID. My user ID I'm actually basing on my authentication GUID. So because I'm using Google, you get a Google GUID back from them, which I'm using. And then in the rules engine, you can set it so that only this user can access their own messages, stuff like that, right? Because you've got security considerations to do, making sure that users can't access other, users' messages, all that sort of fun stuff. I've got a trigger on here, so anytime a document is actually created, I'm going to update the view. I've then got a listener for my my webhook So every time a webhook message actually comes in from Genesys Cloud, so whether the agents responded, a bot within Genesys Cloud has responded, or an in-queue message, any of those sorts of things, it essentially updates Firestore, which then sends the message across. The last one I then have is a receive post message for the agentless message. So every time an agentless message comes across, I then can also do a Cloud Firestore push notification across into the app. So even if the app's completely closed, I then can receive it. Okay, so that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. What I'll probably do now is I'll go the next level down on notifications, because I'm willing to bet that's probably where the most amount of questions are actually going to come up. So I'll go straight into that first. And then by that time, we should have, guessing, about 15 minutes left for questions at the end of it. All right. Oh, missed analytics. So off the back of it as well, then analytics becomes really important over time as you start to scale it out. So you can then build out dashboards to see, usage, users, the locations, all that sort of fun stuff. Any of the apps I build out, I actually use this a lot to even see how long they're spending on certain pages, all that sort of stuff. It's basically like predictive engagement for a native mobile app. We are going to be releasing predictive engagement for support in native mobile apps, but we don't have it yet today from within that. All right, so notifications. So notifications, I like to think of them at a high level in two different ways. The first way is when you go to a website, you're using maybe, the web messenger, you're using whatever it will be, Facebook, whatever, and you get the little pop-up saying, hey, this site wants to send you a notification. Do you allow it, right? You will then allow the notification. Here you can see this orange blob here is basically showing a computer screen. I zoomed this in because it was just too small in the screenshots I had. So this is built out using a progressive web app, this example, and you can see here it's coming saying, hey, do I want to allow notifications? And on your device, if I'm using Chrome, so if Chrome is allowed to send a notification, you get a little OS notification, so Windows, Mac, Linux. And on a mobile device, you get the allow, and then you get the notification screen as you normally would up here, okay? So that is the notification when you're in the moment, when you're having the app actual open and you're receiving the notification. This is actually the web version of how you would actually do this, right? So in a progressive web app, you basically need to request permission to the notification service within the browser. And if notification permission is granted, and you can then send messages, do all sorts of stuff like that, allow, disallow, all that stuff. There's an event listener for that. But that's when you've got it open. When you've got it closed, there's actually a separate API for that. And there's a great bit of, I'll say, library you can use called Workbox, especially in progressive web apps, which takes away a lot of the difficulties in building these out, especially with progressive web apps. And they use things like service workers. Now, service workers are the ability to have some code running in the background and listening in to events. So in a progressive web app, and if I just go back, a progressive web app also gives you the option to, if I go back one more, sorry, also install it. So you could then, actually install it on your device, and then it runs and operates very similar to a native app, right? You then, in your service worker, you can register this backend code. In this case, it's some JavaScript to actually listen. And in the service worker itself, you can then actually register to a push manager, okay? Now, a push manager is a server-side, at a high level, basically a server-side function that you subscribe to, and when you want to receive a notification, it sends a push message, and then once you've got your push message received in your service worker, then you can then notify the app, do all that sort of cool, fun stuff. Straight away, if you're thinking, well, why don't we just use web messaging and put the WebSocket inside the service worker, and then when you receive the WebSocket request in your service worker, do the notification. Service workers do shut down high intensive workloads, as well as they don't have access to things like the document or the window element within the DOM. They just run more in the actual background itself. I tried that and it failed, did not work in that way. So this is actually the feature and function that's coming to the mobile transport SDK, probably realistically more early next year. And what it'll give you the ability to do is actually subscribe to a push manager on our Genesys Cloud server side, right? It's not there yet, hence why you can't do true push notifications with web messaging or transport SDK today, because that feature isn't in our server side. But you can with open messaging, and that's why I've used open messaging as my example, because in that middleware, I'm basically being my push excuse me, my push manager. So my client-side app is subscribing to this on my bit of middleware in my server side and receiving those notifications. So basically, yeah, two different types of notification services you can use. And in Firebase, they actually handle that with this FCM backend, and then they automatically use either the ATL for Android, the Android transport layer, the iOS, the APN for Apple, or in the web push notification, because you can deploy these across multiple platforms. It then handles exactly what we saw before, where you've got the push notification service from a web perspective. Okay, the details when you get further in the weeds on how iOS and Android do this do slightly differ in how you build them out, obviously, but that's where, once again, using a middleware does make it a lot easier from a development perspective as well. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll now open up my VS Code. I'll show you the app, the examples, before we open it up to questions. So let me close this and let me go to, what do we want? We'll start with the server side. So let me bring this up. I'll show you where you can find these as well online once I've done this. So here is my actual server side. Okay, so basically I've got a couple of cloud functions in this one. So I've got a post message. So every time a message is received, there's a receipt message. I'm then just sending a status message back of okay. If a text message is received, I'm then updating my Firestore collection. And once again, so I'm using the user ID as the ID for the user. The messages, I'm adding it, and then I've got a schema I've built out where I've got direction type message, user ID if there's any attachments, and if it's rich media, all that sort of fun stuff. Same if I go further down. Here, I've also then got my push message notification. So right now, Firebase is in the process of actually deprecating this service, and they're replacing it with a new one. I haven't got around to updating this. It'll still work until, what is it, July 2024 from memory. But then they're updating the service. But basically, there's a token in here that I've got from the device itself, and then I'm sending the message and the notification. That's the little push notification. So even if I have it closed, I'm able to receive it. Here's a different message type that I'm receiving, putting it in line, all that sort of fun stuff, notification still as well. And here's the monitoring. So there is a real-time monitoring capability. So if any messages are changed or updated, I'm then actually sending it in using our platform API and using the conversations API in Node.js to send it into Genesys Cloud. I could have had it go the other way where it goes direct, but obviously having everything, both your receive and send, going through the middleware has its advantages. I'm then got the one communication method between the app and my middleware, as well as from a threading perspective, I'm then able to seamlessly thread, both the send and receive messages in. So here's my middleware, then sending that on to Genesys Cloud, basically on behalf of that actual customer client side perspective. Okay, so there's my messages. So that's the server side. It's not too bad. It's pretty light on. And nothing RESTful has been written. It's all using the SDKs that we have. Then from an app perspective, open up here. So the app, once again, I've written it out in Flutter. If you're using React, you could use a very similar sort of concept, or if you're using a different front end, this is just the language I chose to write it in. If you haven't been familiar with this sort of environment, basically everything starts off at the main point and then goes from there. So you can see here, I've got a few different things. So I've got the Android notification channel set up. I've also got, if a background message comes in, I'm going to do my push notification. I'm using lovely orange as my color scheme and my icon, all that sort of fun stuff for the push notification. And then I've got in here whether I'm listening to the standard themes and that, and then if I've got my login, my home screen, if I go into messaging, and here is where the messages, so anytime a message comes in through my collection is updated, I then render the message in line. So here I'm building it out, you know, based on the sign in. If something happens, you know, error handling, all that fun stuff. And then here I've got, if it's a rich media message, what am I going to do? Show a message, you know, show all those different things. And if it's a chat message, how am I going to show it? What's the color scheme? All that sort of fun stuff as well. So if you wanted to go through here and play with that and change that, you can do that. There's obviously the login home screen. I'm not going to go through all of these in the time frame, but you can go through this in your leisure. And for reference, if I minimize these, so here, online here on my GitHub, I've put both the server side as well as the client side. Keep in mind, these aren't, you know, official Genesys examples. These are examples I've built out because I have these conversations all the time with customers and partners in different options in how they can do this. So this is basically the README on how you can set it up, how you can integrate it in with Firebase in the way that I've done it. My rules that I've created, you know, using Flutter, or you can use the other methods as well directly from there. How to set up the keys. You do need a key for Android. If you're also doing Apple, you can add the Apple key in here as well. I run on a Linux device, so I'm running Android. Android for my stuff, and there's the different screenshots I've got. Okay, and then there's the push notification, and yeah, all the different stuff that happens in here, and the APIs need to enable. From a client-side perspective, the same concept. I just went open messaging, Firebase open messaging. Let me go to Fire. Oh, I did them the wrong way around. Sorry, that's the front end. That's the Flutter one. The Flutter one, and this is the server-side one. Sorry. So the server-side one, here you go. So then we've got our cloud functions. How you would set it up inside Genesys Cloud. You need to set up a OAuth client. Your webhook, you do need to set up a webhook. The other thing with webhooks and open messaging, you do get to actually set, if you have a look here, a actual secret token. Now, this is really important, and I'd strongly recommend you do in a production environment. So then that way, the messages that you're receiving from your middleware, you know, are actually from your middleware, and you know they are actually, you know, not just some random server sending messages in pretending to be an actual customer. Okay, there's actually a link on the dev site as well where it shows you how you can set that secret up, as well as encrypt and decrypt it and things like that as well on your client side. Okay, so there's the information all there, and from the developer center perspective, depending on which path you're going down, open messaging, here's all the documentation. So here is that architecture. So there's a high level view. If I want to look at, you know, the actual creating the integration, you would go under here, obviously. You can go through creating secret, the webhook, all the URL, all that stuff. Inbound messages, this is the formatting of the inbound messages. It is all documented on here in the developer center. If I then also flip gears and go to the web messaging view, if you were more looking at it from, you know what, we don't want to build that middleware, we're happy to wait till next year for push notifications and things like that. Here is all the raw guest messaging API endpoints. So the WebSockets, depending on what part of the world you're in, where you would connect to it, how you actually get the configuration, the responses, establishing a session, so configuring a session. So I personally like to understand how they work from a raw API perspective, and then I go into the actual SDK and see, you know, what commands can I do, what views can I do. I find it easier to understand what's happening at the lower level before I add the SDK wrapper over the top. But if you'd prefer, you can go straight to the SDK. It's also shown on our GitHub, the different releases. And if I go under getting started, you can see here's how you do it for the Android, the Java version, and for the Swift, the iOS. This is how you do it. So each of the different components you go through. So maybe if you're sending and receiving messages, as an example, something you're probably most likely going to want to do at some point. Here is the payload, the message state, pending messages, and the methods that happen. And once again, the different parts of these screens, just be aware there's an Android spot, as well as if you click across, there's the iOS version of them. Most of them are similar, but obviously there are some nuances between Swift and Java when you get further outside of just, lets versus vals, things like that. Okay. All right, so in the time we have left, I think I might open it up to questions. I can't actually see the question panel right now. Let me stop sharing and see if I can go back to it.
Yeah, Matt,
See if there's any in there.
we actually don't have any questions. Either you did a really great job, or maybe mobile development is new to everybody, and maybe they're just absorbing what you talked about. But it was a great discussion. Things I had not thought about in terms of the mobile aspect of things. So
yeah, look, it is quite different than your traditional web, because things like mobile, people drop in and out of reception. They're moving between devices. They often have it on multiple devices. There are a lot more things to consider. And I wish I could say everyone do this exact design, do this exact architecture, but it's just not the case, right, in the real world. Yeah, from that perspective.
So
So
Bart Dev did post a question. I don't know if you want to take a look at that. See.
Yeah, so I'll just read it out. So is there a best practice / quick start guide available to guide the creation of messaging UI in native apps using open messaging, of particular interest, ensuring making best use of structured rich media features and rendering? So unfortunately, not really from an open messaging perspective. There are both a blueprint on our developer center. So if I actually share my screen again, there we go, desktop 2. Cool. So if you go actually under the developer center in the blueprints, I think John did it from memory. There was one on here. If I just go find open, where was it? There we go. So, oh no, Yuri the Yeti created this officially. So let me go under here. So this was done in a similar sort of architecture to what I did with Flutter, but it was using Ionic from memory and AWS Lambdas and things like that. Basically the same thing I did, except an AWS version instead of Flutter and Firebase. Okay. Either of them are the same. As for the way you're rendering and showing the rich media objects, that's really up to you in how you want to do it and how you want to build them out. From a messaging perspective, though, those payloads are documented online. If I go under, where are we? Open, will that one give me what I want? I think it will from memory. And let me expand that out. So if I go attachment, no, it's not. Where is it? Inbound open messages. Let's see if it's in here. Inbound. So here's a standard text-based one. Here we go. So here is a actual message with custom attributes, the channel, the from, the time, attachment with photo. So here's the payload, and this is how it's actually going to be formatted out. So the media type, the image URL, all of these different things. How you then visualize that nested JSON object inside your app is completely up to you. In my example, I took the image URL and decided to show that in line as a network image. And if any other, like quick reply buttons or things like that come in, I do them as actual buttons inside a list view object. But it kind of depends. And the pros and cons to open messaging is because it is so open, it means you can kind of do whatever you want and render it however you want. But then I suppose the flip side of that is then it is up to you in how you do it and how you want to do it. So coming up with some pre-designed concepts up front would probably help, especially if you're working with a wider team and how you want to handle it. And that's where a lot of organizations, there is actually a React SDK that's in the works. We have it on our official GitHub for you to trial and use before the official GA. It is open sourced. That does give more pre-built wrappers around what those objects are actually going to look like, but under the hood, it's receiving these same messages in that same way.
right.
There's another one. Yep.
Yeah, I might take this next one. So Angus asked, timeframes for the enhancements would be greatly appreciated. They seem to be in progress or coming, but never have a definitive date. Yeah, Angus, so not to air any dirty laundry or anything here, but there is a large push in the Genesys product management organization right now to do a much better job of communicating through the ideas portal and communicating dates and such. Admittedly, Genesys probably hasn't done as good a job there as we should have, but that is soon to be rectified, and you should see ideas, getting answered sooner, having dates and more communication on those ideas. So, as far as you might be asking about open messaging has not gotten a lot of love as of late. I think the team is focusing more on web messaging at the moment, but I'm hopeful that open messaging is going to get some of the features that they're putting into web messaging flowing through in not too long.
Yeah, and to that point as well, I just went onto the resource center and found that matrix I was referring to earlier around what features are on what channel, and it is a bit of a minefield, I will admit. And it is a constant moving minefield. I'm always, talking to product managers and that around different features and things like that are coming in. So open messaging, as I said, yeah, they're planning to release the typing indicators and quick replies soon. Then after that, the other ones will come. I think one of the reasons web messaging gets most of the love first is because, to be honest, we just have so many more customers using it on websites, so the need and, feature adoption from customers is just wider on that particular piece. But once again, push notifications are so important on an app, right? So yeah, that's it's a constant conversation.
All right. Well, I looks like maybe we have exhausted our questions. Matt, I want to thank you for waking up early. Thank you for doing this with us. It was a great presentation, and we appreciate your time. And everyone, join us. Look out for the end of the month for the next Devcast. All right, we'll catch y'all later. Take care. Bye-bye.